A Miss Marple mystery, a fan fiction in the tradition of Agatha Christie, Gossington Hall, St. Mary Mead, England, spring 1946. Love, in Miss Marple's long experience, was the most reliable blindfold ever devised by nature, which was, of course, precisely why certain people found it so tremendously useful. Chapter 1. The Announcement. There are certain pieces of news that travel through St. Mary Mead not like ordinary information, but like weather, arriving all at once, from every direction simultaneously, carrying with them a particular atmosphere that the village immediately begins to interpret. The announcement of Lady Adelaide Bantry's engagement to a Mr. Edmund Voss of Bath was precisely this sort of news. By 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning in April, it had reached the post office, the chemist's, the butcher's, and 3 separate garden gates, and by 9:30, it had reached Miss Jane Marple, who received it from Mrs. Doris Hartley over the fence between their respective gardens, with an expression of pleasant interest that concealed behind it something considerably more attentive. "Bath," Miss Marple repeated, snipping a stem with the measured deliberateness she brought to all things. "How long has he been in Bath?" "That's just it," said Mrs. Hartley, leaning a degree further over the fence. "Nobody seems to know how long he's been anywhere. He simply appeared, about 6 months ago, at one of those subscription concerts Lady Bantry attends. Very distinguished by all accounts. Silver at the temples, a beautiful speaking voice. Mrs. Price Ridley saw them at the Goose and Crown last February and said he had the manners of a duke." Mrs. Price Ridley is not always a reliable judge of manners, said Miss Marple pleasantly, but she is an excellent judge of intent. Did she think he seemed genuinely fond of Lady Bantry? Mrs. Hartley considered this with the serious expression it deserved. She said he seemed attentive, very attentive. Whether that is the same as fond? She spread her hands. Miss Marple thought it was not necessarily the same thing at all. Gossington Hall had stood on the eastern edge of St. Mary Mead for 200 years, a solid, unassuming Georgian manor, whose most dramatic feature had always been the library, which Colonel Bantry had filled with military histories and fishing records, and an excellent collection of port. Colonel Arthur Bantry had died 4 years ago of a heart complaint that had been threatening him for a decade. And had left the hall to his wife Adelaide, with the comfortable assurance of a man who had always trusted her to manage perfectly well without him. She had, in the way of capable women, done exactly that. She had opened the gardens for the village fete. She had let the east wing to a pleasant professor from Cambridge. She had reorganized the kitchen garden with ruthless efficiency. She had also, apparently, met a Mr. Edmund Voss at a subscription concert and agreed, at the age of 58, to marry him. Miss Marple called at Gossington Hall that same afternoon, bearing a jar of her greengage preserve and the perfectly genuine warmth she felt for Lady Bantry, who had been her friend for 20 years, and who deserved, in Miss Marple's sincere opinion, every happiness available to her. Lady Bantry received her in the drawing-room, with the slightly pink, slightly breathless quality of a woman in the early stages of happiness, the stage where it still surprises her. She was a handsome woman, square-built and direct in her manner, with white hair and very clear blue eyes that had never, in all the years Miss Marple had known her, looked quite so young as they looked this afternoon. "You will like him, Jane," she said, pouring tea. "He is not at all what you might expect. He is not obvious about it. Some men of that sort, you know, the charming widower variety, are so tremendously charming that one is immediately suspicious. Edmund is simply himself. quiet, thoughtful. He listens. She smiled. Arthur, bless him, never really listened. Edmund listens as though what you are saying is the most interesting thing he has heard all week. He sounds delightful, said Miss Marple. Have you met his family? His people? He has no immediate family. His parents died when he was young. He was married once before, a first wife years ago. She died. He doesn't speak of it much, which I find rather touching. Some men go on and on about their first wives, and it is perfectly exhausting. Quite, said Miss Marple. And his work, his background. He has investments, something in the city before he retired. He is quite comfortably settled. Lady Bantry handed across the cup. You are doing that thing. Jane. What thing? That thing where you ask perfectly ordinary questions in a perfectly ordinary voice, and somehow each one is slightly more pointed than the last. But she said it with affection, not irritation. Miss Marple smiled and said nothing, and drank her tea, and looked about the room with the mild, wandering attention of an elderly woman admiring familiar furnishings. The library door was open. She could see from where she sat the wall where Colonel Bantry's regimental photograph had always hung, a large, rather formal group portrait taken in 1921, the colonel in the center, various officers arranged around him in the rigid posture of men who have been told to stand still. The photograph was gone. In its place was a pale rectangle on the wallpaper, the ghost of it still visible, 4 clean edges where the frame had hung for 20 years. Miss Marple noted this with the quietness she brought to all important observations, and said nothing at all, and finished her tea and spoke warmly of the Greengage Preserve. But driving home in the evening light, she thought about missing photographs, and about investment income with no traceable source, and about first wives who died. She thought, in particular, about the old gardener Hobbs, who had worked at Gossington Hall for 30 years and who had, when she had passed him at the gate on her way in, looked at her with an expression she had recognized immediately. It was the expression of a man who has something to say and does not yet know whether it is safe to say it. Chapter 2. The Man from Bath. Edmund Voss was introduced to St. Mary Mead at a small dinner Lady Bantry gave the following Saturday. 6 guests, the good china, the dining room smelling of beeswax and late narcissus from the garden. Miss Marple sat to his left, which was either Lady Bantry's oversight or her quiet acknowledgment that if anyone was going to form a useful opinion of the man, it would be her old friend Jane. He was exactly as described. Silver at the temples, as Mrs. Hartley had said. A beautiful voice, low and measured, with the faint residue of an accent that had been carefully smoothed but not entirely eliminated. Miss Marple placed it, after 2 sentences, as northern. Lancashire, possibly, though he spoke now with the polished vowels of a man who had spent some years in Bath. He was attentive to Lady Bantry in the precise way she had described, that quality of listening, as though her words mattered, turning toward her when she spoke, his attention unhurried and complete. It was, Miss Marple reflected, an extremely accomplished performance. Or it was genuine. The two were, from the outside, identical, which was the fundamental difficulty. She engaged him in conversation about Bath, which he spoke of fluently, the architecture, the assembly rooms, the river walk. She asked about his previous residence, and he said London, briefly, before Bath. She asked about the city work Lady Bantry had mentioned, and he gave a pleasantly vague answer about property interests and early retirement, accompanied by the small, self-deprecating smile of a man who prefers modesty about money. Miss Marple found false modesty about money one of the more reliable warning signs available. "And before London?" she asked, in the tone of pure social curiosity. A fractional pause. Not long enough for a stranger to catch. Long enough for Miss Marple. "Here and there," he said pleasantly. "I was something of a wanderer in my younger years. The North, mostly. I find I prefer the South." "Many people do," said Miss Marple, "though the North has its own particular qualities. Lancashire, for instance. I have a niece in Preston. A very fine county." "Very fine indeed," he agreed, and turned to speak to the person on his right, with the smooth ease of a man who has had practice at changing conversations. Miss Marple ate her soup and watched him for the remainder of the evening with the patient, comprehensive attention of a woman who has nothing to do but observe, and who has long since made observation her primary occupation. She noted several things. He ate very little, though he appeared to eat with appetite, the social mimicry of someone concentrating on other things. He asked Lady Bantry twice, in the natural flow of conversation, questions about the estate management, the tenancy arrangements, the outstanding lease on the east wing, the state of the kitchen garden investment. Each question was posed as warm interest. Each answer was absorbed with the completeness of a man filing information. The other guests noticed nothing. They were charmed. Mr. Voss was, it had to be admitted, a master-class in the application of charm to a room. He told a modest and well-timed story about a fishing mishap in Scotland. He asked Dr. Pugh about his practice with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. He complimented Mrs. Weatherby on her brooch in terms specific enough to suggest real appreciation. Only once did his composure shift, and it was so brief that Miss Marple might have imagined it. The old butler, Baines, came in to remove the soup plates, and behind him, visible for a moment through the service door, was Hobbs, the gardener, 67 years old and white-haired, passing through the corridor with a tray. Voss saw him, and Hobbs, looking up at precisely the wrong or right moment, saw Voss. What passed between them in that half-second was not recognition of the ordinary kind. It was the particular recognition of two people who have met before in circumstances that neither is prepared to acknowledge. Hobbs looked away first. His hands on the tray tightened almost imperceptibly. He walked on. Voss returned to his conversation without a break, but his left hand, resting beside his wine-glass, had closed into a loose fist for just a moment before it relaxed. Miss Marple filed this away with all the other things she was filing away, and accepted a second helping of the excellent lamb, and was thoroughly charming to everyone at the table. She left at 10:30, earlier than the others, claiming the night air and her age. Lady Bantry walked her to the door and said, in the low voice of someone hoping for a particular answer, "Well, what do you think of him, Jane?" Miss Marple put on her coat with the assistance of the hallway mirror and said quite truthfully, "He is a very accomplished man, Adelaide. Very accomplished indeed." She did not say at what. On the way home she paused at the gate where Hobbs had his cottage, but the light was out. Tomorrow, she thought. She would speak to Hobbs tomorrow. Hobbs was dead by morning. Chapter 3. Heart Failure. The official account, delivered by Dr. Pugh with the measured sympathy of a country practitioner accustomed to the deaths of elderly laborers, was straightforward. Hobbs had been found by the undercook, Mrs. Watts, when she went to return a pair of shears he had borrowed. He was in his chair, the morning paper across his lap, a half-drunk cup of tea on the table beside him. He had been 67. He had had a cardiac history. The weather had turned cold. These things happened. Inspector Slack, called in as a matter of procedure, agreed that these things happened. recorded the details with the brisk efficiency of a man who wishes to close a file before lunch, and departed. Miss Marple arrived at Gossington Hall at 10 o'clock, before the inquest had been confirmed, and before Lady Bantry had entirely recovered from the shock of losing a man who had worked in her garden for 3 decades. She found her employer in the morning room with Edmund Voss sitting beside her, his hand covering hers, his expression one of grave and considerate sympathy. Miss Marple expressed her condolences with sincerity. She had liked old Hobbs, who had opinions about roses that she had found both wrong and entertaining, and asked whether she might see Mrs. Watts, who had found him, as the woman had apparently been rather shaken. Lady Bantry said, of course, and Voss rose to show her to the kitchen, which Miss Marple did not require but accepted, as it gave her 30 seconds of walking beside him in a corridor. Such a loss, she said. He had been here a long time. So, I understand, said Voss. Lady Bantry is very fond of the old staff. He would have remembered Colonel Bantry's time, the old days. A pause. I believe he had a good memory for faces. Gardeners often do. Something about the patient observation involved, I have always thought. Voss stopped at the kitchen door and held it open for her with a smile that reached, this time, precisely as far as was required and no further. Here is Mrs. Watts, he said. I will leave you to it. Mrs. Watts was a stout woman in her 50s, red-eyed and clasping a handkerchief. She said Hobbs had been perfectly well the previous evening. She had seen him at 7 o'clock, and he had been talking about the spring planting, which was not the conversation of a dying man. She said he had seemed worried. She used that word specifically, worried. About the planting? Miss Marple asked. No, about, well, I don't rightly know. He said something odd. He said, there's a thing I ought to have said by now and haven't, and I'm not sure I can much longer leave it. I thought he meant the new rose bed. He and Lady Bantry had been disagreeing about the location. But now I don't know. She twisted the handkerchief. You don't think. I think Hobbs was a very good man who had a great deal of common sense, said Miss Marple firmly. And I think your account of him is very helpful, Mrs. Watts. Very helpful indeed. She walked through the kitchen garden afterward, slowly in the April cold, and Hobbs's tools were in the shed, neatly arranged with the order of a professional. His notebook, gardener's notebooks, all planting dates and soil observations and small complaints about the weather, was on the shelf. Miss Marple opened it briefly, as was perhaps not entirely her place. The last entry was from 2 days ago. Below the record of soil temperatures and seed orders, in handwriting slightly different from the careful print above, was a single line. Saw him again. Certain now. Must speak to someone. EV equals EV. 2 sets of initials, the same letters. Edmund Voss and someone else. Miss Marple put the notebook back exactly as she had found it and stood in the cold shed for a moment, thinking about a man who had been certain of something, had decided to speak, and had died in his chair before morning. She thought about Dr. Pugh, who was a conscientious practitioner, but not an especially suspicious one. She thought about the cup of tea on the table beside the body, the half-drunk cup that no one had thought to query, because an old man with a cardiac history dying in his chair with a cup of tea was not a picture that invited questions. She thought about what could be administered in tea that would look, to a general practitioner in a village, like the natural conclusion of a weak heart. She went directly from the kitchen garden to the post office, and sent a telegram to her nephew Raymond's colleague in London, a man she had met at a Christmas gathering who worked in a forensic capacity for the Home Office, and who had once said, in the generous way of people after their third glass of wine, that she must not hesitate to call upon him if ever she needed a discreet professional opinion. The telegram said simply, "Require information on cardiac mimicking compounds available to lay persons. Discretion essential. J. Marple." Then she walked home and sat in her garden in the thin April sun and thought about the initials E.V. and what they might stand for, and what old Hobbes had known. Chapter 4. What Diana brought Diana Bantry arrived from London on the Wednesday train, the 12:15, which deposited her at Little Paddock Station in a flurry of luggage and the particular energy of a young woman who has been thinking hard for most of a 2-hour journey, and has arrived at conclusions she is not certain what to do with. She was 26, fair-haired and blue-eyed in the Bantry manner, with more of her father's directness than her mother's warmth. She had been in London for 3 years, working for a publishing house in Bloomsbury, and living in a flat in Pimlico with 2 other women, and the sort of cheerful, purposeful freedom that her mother's generation had not had, and her own occasionally forgot to appreciate. Miss Marple had always been fond of Diana, who was one of those young people who took old ladies seriously rather than humoring them, which was, in Miss Marple's experience, an excellent indicator of general intelligence. She called at Gossington Hall on Thursday morning, ostensibly to return a book she had borrowed from Lady Bantry's library, and found Diana in the garden, doing what her father had always done when he was troubled, walking up and down the kitchen garden path with her hands in her coat pockets, not looking at anything in particular. "Miss Marple," the relief in Diana's voice was not entirely concealed, "I was going to come to you today. I need to talk to someone with sense." They walked together in the way that is easier for difficult conversations than sitting still. Diana had met Edmund Voss at Christmas, when he had first been introduced as her mother's particular friend. She had not liked him, and had felt guilty for not liking him because her mother was so transparently happy. She had gone back to London and tried to be sensible about it. She wanted her mother to be happy. Voss was perfectly agreeable on the surface, but perhaps she was simply being protective in an unreasonable way. But then, in February, she had mentioned Edmund Voss to a colleague at the publishing house, a woman called Pauline Marsh, whose father was a solicitor in Lancashire. And Pauline had gone rather still and said, "Edmund Voss, that's an unusual name. My father had a client called Edmund Voss some years ago, but he went by a different surname then." "What surname?" Miss Marple asked. "Vane." Diana said it quietly. "Edward Vane. He married a woman in Clitheroe, a widow, quite comfortably off. Pauline's father handled some of the woman's affairs. She died about 8 months after the wedding. Heart failure, they said. Vane inherited a significant portion of her estate. There were no children. And then he simply disappeared. This would have been 1934. Miss Marple walked without speaking for a moment. Pauline's father tried to raise questions at the time. Diana continued. He thought it was rather fast, the marriage, the death, the inheritance. But there was a death certificate, properly filed, and the husband was perfectly cooperative with the coroner, and in the end there was nothing concrete to pursue. The man had simply been lucky or unlucky, depending on how you looked at it. And Pauline's father is certain it is the same man? Not certain. The name is similar but not identical, but the description, the coloring, the manner, the northern origin with the smoothed accent. Pauline says her father would recognize him if he saw him. He said Vane had a way of being excessively charming that made him think of a door-to-door salesman. Very polished, always slightly too appropriate. Miss Marple thought of the dinner party, the perfectly timed fishing story, the precisely calibrated interest in each person, the hand covering Lady Bantry's in the morning room. "You haven't told your mother." "How do I tell my mother?" Diana's voice cracked slightly and then held. "She is happy, Miss Marple. She has been quite grey since Father died. Not unhappy exactly, just reduced. And now she is not reduced. And I might be entirely wrong. It might be a coincidence of names and descriptions. And if I say anything and I am wrong, she will never—" "You are not wrong," said Miss Marple. Diana stopped walking. "You knew already." "I knew something was wrong. I did not yet have a name for it." Miss Marple looked at the kitchen garden, at the empty plot where Hobbs had been planning his new rose bed, the soil turned but unplanted now, waiting. "Edward Vane. That is very useful, Diana. That is exactly what I needed. What will you do?" "I will write some letters," said Miss Marple. "I will speak to Inspector Slack, and I will look for something Colonel Bantry left behind, which I believe is still in this house, if it has not been found and removed already." "What did Father leave behind?" "Insurance," said Miss Marple simply. "Your father was a careful man. Careful men make provisions for the things they hope will never be necessary." She patted Diana's arm. "Say nothing to your mother for the moment. And keep your door locked at night." She said this last in exactly the same tone she used for everything, which meant Diana was halfway back to the house before she stopped and stood very still and understood what had been implied. Chapter 5. The Missing Photograph. The thing about Gossington Hall's library was that Miss Marple had been in it approximately 40 times over 20 years, and she had a memory for interiors of the same precise, retentive kind that she had for faces, names, and the details of things people said when they thought they were being casual. She knew every photograph on every wall. She knew the arrangement of the bookshelves and the particular way the afternoon light came through the south window onto the reading table. She knew where Colonel Bantry had kept his port and where he had hidden, less successfully than he imagined, his private opinions about their neighbors in the margins of old county directories. She asked Lady Bantry, on a Friday morning visit, whether she might borrow a book from the library, a military history she vaguely recalled seeing there, something about the North African campaign. Lady Bantry said of course, and went to speak to the housekeeper, and Miss Marple spent 12 minutes alone in the library. The regimental photograph was gone, as she had seen from the drawing-room on her first visit. But standing now in the library itself, she could assess the removal more precisely. It had been a large photograph, approximately 30 inches by 20, in a dark wooden frame. The ghost on the wallpaper was clear. The 2 hooks were still in the wall, freshly empty. She examined the remaining photographs methodically. Colonel Bantry at various sporting occasions. A hunt photograph from 1928. Several family portraits. A photograph of a regimental dinner, 1919, crowded with men in formal uniform around a long table. She studied this one for some time. In the right background, almost at the edge of the frame, stood a young man of perhaps 22 or 23, dark-haired, angular, with the particular quality of stillness that certain faces carry even in photographs. He was not in uniform. He was a guest, perhaps, a civilian at the periphery of a military occasion. Miss Marple could not be certain. The photograph was old and the figure was small. But the set of the shoulders, the line of the jaw, she committed it to memory with the careful deliberateness she brought to all important things, and moved on. She found the military history easily. It was where she had remembered it, which was satisfying, and was replacing a neighboring volume when she noticed that one section of the shelving seemed slightly irregular, not dramatically so. Just the faint evidence of books that had been removed and replaced in a slightly different order, or by slightly different hands. The section was the personal correspondence shelf, the long row of letter files and document boxes that Colonel Bantry had kept with military organization. One box was missing. A dark green box, she thought, recalling a previous visit. It had been in the second row, third from the left. The gap had been closed by sliding the remaining boxes along, but the sliding had been slightly uneven. She noted the position, and left with her military history and a clear idea of what had been taken and approximately when. The question was whether Colonel Bantry's provision, the sealed envelope Diana had not known about, but which Miss Marple was increasingly confident existed, had been in that box, or whether it had been held elsewhere. She called on Mr. Pethwick, the solicitor, that same afternoon. Mr. Pethwick's office was on the High Street, above the ironmonger's, and smelled of old paper and the particular dry warmth of rooms that are heated entirely by work rather than comfort. Pethwick himself was a small, careful man of 60, with the natural caution of someone who had spent a career being trusted with other people's difficulties. He had handled the Bantry family's affairs for 15 years. He received Miss Marple with the polite wariness of a solicitor, who knows that a visit from her means something is happening, but does not yet know what. Miss Marple was direct. "Did Colonel Bantry leave any sealed or conditional document with you? Something to be opened in particular circumstances?" A pause. Pethwick aligned a pen on his desk with unnecessary precision. "Miss Marple, client confidentiality. Mr. Pethwick." Her voice was gentle and entirely firm. "An elderly employee of Gossington Hall is dead under circumstances I find deeply unsatisfying. Lady Bantry's new husband is not who he says he is, and I believe the Colonel, who was a thorough man, made provision for exactly this kind of situation. If he did, and if that provision exists in your keeping, the moment to act on it is now. Not next week, not after the wedding anniversary, not when it is convenient. Now." Pethwick looked at her for a long moment. She had the impression of a man performing a rapid internal calculation involving duty, courage, and the memory of a client he had genuinely respected. He opened his desk drawer. He removed an envelope, cream, sealed with red wax, the Colonel's initials pressed into it. On the front, in Colonel Bantry's precise military hand, to be opened in the event of any threat to the safety or integrity of Gossington Hall or its mistress. "He gave it to me in 1940, said Pethwick quietly. "He said he hoped I would never need to open it. He said he had seen something that troubled him and was not sure what to do about it, and he wanted there to be a record." Miss Marple looked at the envelope. "I think," she said, "we should open it together, and then you should telephone Inspector Slack." Chapter 6. The Sealed Envelope. Inside the envelope, in Colonel Bantry's hand, neat, precise, the handwriting of a man who had written field reports in difficult conditions and never once been ambiguous, was a folded sheet of writing paper, a smaller envelope, and a photograph. The photograph showed two men at what appeared to be a race meeting, circa 1936 or 1937, judging by the hat styles. One was Colonel Bantry, somewhat younger, squinting in bright sun. The other was a man in his late 20s, dark-haired, angular, well-dressed, with his face turned 3/4 to the camera in the way of someone who did not know he was being photographed. Miss Marple looked at the photograph for a long moment, and then set it down without speaking, The letter read, "I write this because I am a man who has kept his own counsel too long on a matter that may become important. In the summer of 1936 at Newmarket, I encountered a man who gave his name as Edward Vane. He was introduced through the brother of an acquaintance, and was making himself very agreeable to a recently widowed woman named Mrs. Clara Forsyth of Clitheroe. I thought nothing of it at the time. In December 1936, I learned through my friend Major Hargreaves, who has Lancashire connections, that Mrs. Clara Forsyth had died in October of that year, some 6 weeks after a quiet marriage to a Mr. Edward Vane. The estate passed largely to the husband. Vane could not subsequently be found. I do not know if this is a matter for the police. I do not know if I am correct in my suspicions. But I have enclosed herein the photograph, and I have written this account because I am a soldier, and a soldier keeps records. If this envelope is opened, it means Adelaide is in some danger I did not anticipate. I am sorry I cannot do more." A.B. Pethwick sat very still when she finished reading aloud. The clock on his mantelpiece ticked with the loud determination of a clock in a quiet room. "He knew," Pethwick said at last. "He suspected this man existed, and he left a record, and he died before any of it became relevant. He was very like Arthur," Miss Marple said. "He trusted people to do the right thing with the right information at the right time. He left the information. He trusted the time to come." She folded the letter carefully. "Telephone Inspector Slack now, please, and ask him to make inquiries with the Lancashire Constabulary regarding the death of a Mrs. Clara Forsyth of Clitheroe in 1936, and the subsequent whereabouts of a Mr. Edward Vane. This photograph should be sent to them for identification." Slack arrived at Pethwick's office 40 minutes later, in his habitual state of slightly harassed efficiency. He was, as Miss Marple had always acknowledged privately, a better policeman than he appeared when dealing with her, which he found trying, and a worse one than he appeared when dealing with people he dismissed, which was most people. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the letter. He looked at Miss Marple with the expression he always wore when she had done something useful that he wished he had done first. "This is all very well," he said, "but it is not proof. It is a photograph of a man who looks like the man in question, in a letter written by a man who suspected something without being certain. Lancashire will need to confirm the identification. That takes time." "I am aware," said Miss Marple. "However, while Lancashire are confirming the identification, I would ask you to do 2 things. First, look again at the death of Hobbs. Specifically, have the remaining tea examined. I believe he may have been assisted toward his cardiac event. Second, establish the terms of Lady Bantry's current will. I believe you will find that Mr. Voss encouraged her to revise it recently, and I believe the revision will be illuminating." Slack wrote things down. He always wrote things down, which was, she thought, his most reliable quality. "And the third thing?" he asked, because he had learned that Miss Marple's lists were rarely as short as they initially appeared. "The third thing," she said, "is to leave Mr. Voss entirely undisturbed for the moment. I do not want him to know that the envelope has been opened. I have a dinner party to arrange." Slack looked up from his notebook. "A dinner party?" "At Gossington Hall, in approximately 1 week, by which time Lancashire will have replied, the tea will have been tested, and I will have spoken to everyone I need to speak to." She stood, collecting her coat and bag with the efficiency of a small woman who has never wasted a movement in her life. "The Colonel made provision," she said. "Now we simply need to use it." Chapter 7. Inspector Slack Investigates. Inspector Slack spent the better part of the following week doing things he would, under normal circumstances, not have done on the basis of an old lady's instincts, and trying not to think too hard about the fact that he had long since learned at considerable personal cost that her instincts were not ordinary instincts, but something closer to a finely calibrated instrument that he did not fully understand and had given up trying to dismiss. The tea had been the first thing. Obtaining a sample had required a degree of ingenuity, since the cottage had been tidied and the cup washed in the ordinary course of events. But Mrs. Watts, the under-cook who had found Hobbs, had mentioned that there was a second cup. She had made 2 that morning, carrying one to the potting shed where Hobbs sometimes worked early. That cup had been found washed and drained on the rack, but the internal residue of a ceramic cup, Slack's contact at the county laboratory patiently explained, was not entirely eliminated by ordinary washing. The residue was examined. The result came back on Thursday. Digitalis, specifically digoxin, in a concentration consistent with a therapeutic cardiac dose, now dried to a faint film on the interior of an old tin mug. The concentration was not lethal in isolation. In a man with a compromised heart taking it alongside his ordinary medication, it could, plausibly, naturally, without any dramatic intervention, push an already struggling organ past its limit. Slack sat with this information for some time before telephoning Miss Marple. "I know," she said, before he had finished explaining. "You knew?" "I suspected. I am glad to have it confirmed." A brief pause. "Inspector, this is now a murder inquiry. I hope you will treat it as such. I am well aware. I say it only because of Mr. Voss. He is a careful man. If he believes himself suspected, he will move, either against Lady Bantry, which I do not want to contemplate, or simply away, to another city, another name, another widow. He has done it before." Lancashire had replied by Friday. The reply was thorough and to Slack enormously clarifying. Edward Vane was known to the Clitheroe Constabulary. He had married Clara Forsyth in August 1936. She had died in October. The coroner had recorded natural causes. Vane had inherited and disappeared. There had been an inquiry, inconclusive. The investigating officer had since retired but had kept his notes, in the way of officers who were never entirely satisfied with their conclusions, and had forwarded them. The notes included a physical description: height, coloring, a scar on the left wrist from a childhood injury, a particular habit of stillness when thinking. They included testimony from 2 witnesses who had found his manner unsettling, without being able to say precisely why. They included one other detail. In Vane's application for a marriage license in 1936, his previous address was listed as Manchester. Before Manchester, a town called Haslingden. And in Haslingden, the notes recorded, there had been a question some years earlier about the death of an elderly woman, an aunt of Vane's, whose estate he had inherited at the age of 23. No charges, no inquest, simply a question, raised by a neighbor, and then not pursued. A pattern, then. Not a single crime, but a method. Refined over years, carried from place to place, wearing different names as the occasion required. Slack also, as instructed, inquired about Lady Bantry's will. The inquiry required some delicacy, but Pethwick, who had been Lady Bantry's solicitor, and was now in the grip of the particular motivation of a professional who understands he narrowly missed a serious failure of duty, was cooperative. Lady Bantry had revised her will in February, 6 weeks after the engagement was announced. The new will made Edmund Voss the principal beneficiary of the Gossington Hall estate, with Diana receiving a personal bequest and the remaining staff provisions. "She was in love," said Pethwick, in the tone of a man cataloguing a disaster. "She simply wanted to—" "She wanted to be generous," said Miss Marple, when Slack relayed this. "People in love are always generous in their wills. It is one of the reasons that love is so useful to a certain type of person." By Friday evening, Slack had laid out before him the accumulated architecture of what Edmund Voss, Edward Vane, had built and was building. The poison was established. The identity was established. The motive was established. What he needed was the man, in a room, with no warning and no exit. Miss Marple had promised him a dinner party. "Saturday week," she said on the telephone. "You will need to be in the house by 8 o'clock. I will arrange for you to be in the butler's pantry. It is adjacent to the dining room, and the door latches from inside. You will hear everything. When I give the signal, you may come in." "What is the signal?" Slack asked. "I will quote Colonel Bantry," she said. "I will say that Arthur was a man who left nothing to chance. That will be the moment." Slack wrote it down. Chapter 8. Diana's Courage. The days before the dinner party were the longest Diana Bantry had spent since her father's death, a comparison she made to herself with some surprise, because the analogy felt right in the same specific way. Both were periods of knowing something terrible and waiting for the shape of it to become clear. Both required a particular kind of stillness that was not peace, but its disciplined imitation. She had returned to London on Monday, as planned, to avoid rousing Voss's suspicion. She had sat in her Pimlico flat and telephoned Pauline Marsh and given her the name Edward Vane, and asked whether her father might be prepared to make a formal statement to the Lancashire Constabulary. Pauline had said she would ask. She had called back within the hour to say that Mr. Marsh had been waiting to make exactly that statement for 8 years, and would drive to the police station himself that afternoon. She came back to Gossington Hall on Friday afternoon, carrying a small case and the face she had been practicing for days, the face of a daughter who has decided to give her mother's new husband a fair chance. She had chosen to come back for the weekend, she told her mother, because she had been thinking about their last conversation, and decided she was being too cautious, too London, not enough open to good things. Lady Bantry had embraced her with the warmth of a woman who has been slightly anxious about her daughter, and is relieved to set it aside. Voss had shaken Diana's hand and said he was very glad she had come, and looked at her with his precise, calibrated smile. Diana smiled back with an equal precision she had not previously known herself capable of. Miss Marple came to tea on Saturday, the day before the dinner party, and sat with Diana in the upstairs sitting room while Lady Bantry rested and Voss was in the garden. "Are you all right?" Miss Marple asked. "I am frightened," Diana said. There was relief in saying it plainly. "Not for myself, for Mother. If this goes wrong, if he works out what's happening, she is in this house with him and I don't—" "He will not work out what is happening," said Miss Marple. "He is a clever man, and a dangerous one, but his cleverness is of a particular kind. It is the cleverness of someone who has always succeeded by being underestimated, by moving before people are ready, by choosing situations where no one has reason to look closely. He has not encountered a situation where someone has been looking closely for some time." A brief, dry pause. "He underestimates me because I am old, and because I am a woman, and because I talk about gardens. It is the most useful thing about being what I am." Diana looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but contained one. "What do you need from me tomorrow?" she asked. I need you to tell your story. Not to Voss, to everyone in the room, as though you have just remembered it, as though it is a curious social detail that simply came up. You will mention that a colleague's father was once a solicitor to a man named Edward Vane in Lancashire, who married a widow there in 1936. You will say you mentioned it to Edmund because you thought it was such an odd coincidence of initials. You will watch his face when you say this. And then I will say something about Colonel Bantry being a man who left nothing to chance. And the rest will follow. Diana thought about her father, the careful, slightly stuffy, deeply decent man who had kept a photograph and written a letter and sealed it in an envelope in case his wife ever needed it. She thought about him dying without knowing whether she would. He would be here if he could, she said. Not a question. He made provision because he couldn't be, said Miss Marple. That is, in its way, the same thing. The dinner party was set for Sunday at 7. Miss Marple had suggested the guest list. Herself, Diana, Dr. Pugh and his wife, Mr. Pethwick, and the Weatherbys, whose presence was primarily structural, providing the numbers and normality required to keep Voss from sensing any unusual configuration. 7 people at dinner was entirely ordinary. 7 people at dinner, one of whom was building toward a specific truth, was something else entirely. Lady Bantry planned the menu with the pleasure of a woman who enjoys feeding people, and who was, Miss Marple noted with a private ache, entirely happy and entirely oblivious. She consulted about the fish course. She worried about the burgundy. She told Edmund over breakfast that she was so glad they had their friends around them, and he said he was glad too. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her own fire and thought about Lady Bantry saying that Edmund listened as though what she was saying was the most interesting thing he had heard all week. She thought about all the widows who had been listened to in precisely that way, by precisely that quality of attention. She thought about Clara Forsyth of Clitheroe, dead at 56, whose husband had been so cooperative with the coroner. She banked the fire and went to bed and lay awake for a short while, and then, because she had learned long ago that the night before a reckoning was not the time for second thoughts, she went to sleep. Chapter 9. The Dinner Party. It was the sort of dinner party that appeared, from the outside, to be nothing more than what it was. A table of 8 in a well-lit dining room, good food, moderate wine, the comfortable conversation of people who know each other well enough to talk without effort. The chrysanthemums in the center were white. The candles were lit. No Baines, who had been with the household for 30 years, and who Miss Marple had asked, with quiet specificity, to remain available that evening, moved between courses with professional invisibility. Edmund Voss was in excellent form. He told a graceful story about a walking tour in the Cotswolds. He drew Dr. Pugh into an extended conversation about fly fishing, at which he appeared genuinely knowledgeable. He poured Lady Bantry's wine before she reached for it, and touched her hand briefly when she laughed at something. The small, practiced intimacies of a man who understood that love, when performed consistently, becomes indistinguishable from the genuine article. Miss Marple ate her fish and watched and waited. It was over the main course that Diana began. She did it well, better than Miss Marple had expected, with the natural timing of someone who had thought it through until it felt unrehearsed. The most curious thing came up at work last week, she said, into a pause in the general conversation. One of my colleagues, her father was a solicitor in Lancashire years ago. She was telling me about a case he had. A widow who remarried rather quickly and then died rather quickly, and the husband collected the estate and disappeared. The sort of thing you only read about in novels, one thinks, but apparently not. She looked down the table with the pleasant face of someone sharing a mildly diverting story. The man's name was Edward Vane, which I thought was such an odd coincidence. The initials, you know. E.V. Edmund's initials. I nearly mentioned it to Edmund before I thought how absurd that would sound. She laughed lightly. Several guests smiled in the way people do at slightly odd coincidences. Dr. Pugh said something about the frequency of initials repeating. Voss did not move. He sat perfectly, absolutely still for the space of one breath. And then he lifted his wine-glass and drank from it with a control that was so complete it was itself a kind of answer. Miss Marple saw his left hand, below the table level, close once into a fist. She waited until the table had moved on to a general conversation about the summer fete, and then she said, into a slight lull, pleasantly, conversationally, in the tone she used for garden observations and village gossip, "Lady Bantry, do you know, I was thinking this afternoon about that envelope of Arthur's that Mr. Pethwick has been keeping. Such a characteristic thing. Arthur was a man who left nothing to chance, or always provided for every contingency." Lady Bantry began to say something warm about Arthur's thoroughness. The butler's pantry door opened. Inspector Slack came into the dining room with a constable, and the particular quality of his presence, a policeman in a dinner, changed the atmosphere of the room in the instantaneous way that such presences always do. The guests fell silent with the reflexive attention of people who have realized, without being told, that the evening has become something they will remember for a long time. "Mr. Edmund Voss," said Slack, with the flat economy of a man who has rehearsed this carefully. "I am Inspector Slack of the County Constabulary. I have some questions I would like you to answer regarding your identity and your whereabouts in Lancashire in 1936. The table was very still. The chrysanthemums were white in the candlelight. Voss looked at Slack for a moment. Then he looked at Miss Marple. It was a long look, not hostile, not afraid, but with the quality of a man recalibrating a calculation he had believed secure. "Miss Marple," he said. His voice was perfectly even. "Mr. Vane," she said. Something settled in his face, a kind of finality. He looked briefly like a man setting down something he has carried a long way. Lady Bantry said in a voice she was holding together with evident effort, Edmund, I don't understand." "I will explain everything," said Slack firmly, addressing her directly for the first time. "Not now, Lady Bantry. Tomorrow, clearly and completely. Tonight I simply need Mr. Voss to come with us." Voss rose from his chair, with the composed deliberateness of a man who has decided that the performance is over, and there is nothing to be gained from disorder. He buttoned his jacket. He looked once more at Lady Bantry, and whatever was in that look, Miss Marple could not entirely read it. It was not nothing. It was also not what Lady Bantry had believed it was. He went with Slack without resistance, which was the last intelligent thing he did that evening. The remaining guests sat at the dinner table in the specific silence that follows the departure of something. The candles burned. The burgundy stood in its glasses. Baines appeared at the door with the perfect instinct of an old household servant and asked whether anyone would like coffee. Lady Bantry looked at Miss Marple with eyes that were dry and very wide, and doing the hard work of a woman who will cry later, much later, when she is alone, and not before. "Tell me," she said. "I will," said Miss Marple. "All of it. Tonight." Chapter 10. What Adelaide Kept. They sat together until past midnight, just the two of them, in the drawing-room where the fire had been made up, and the other guests had tactfully departed. Baines had brought coffee and left. Diana had stayed for a while, and then withdrawn at a look from Miss Marple, understanding that this particular conversation was between two women of a certain age, and that it required privacy. Miss Marple told Lady Bantry everything, not quickly, not brutally, but with the careful completeness of someone who understands that partial truth, when the full truth is available, is a cruelty disguised as kindness. She told her about Hobbs and the tea. She told her about the Lancashire widow, and the sealed envelope, and the Colonel's letter. She told her about Edward Vane, and the pattern of it, the method, the repetition, the cold architecture of what had looked from the inside like something entirely different. Lady Bantry listened without interrupting. She sat very straight in Arthur's old armchair, and held her coffee cup, and let it go cold, and said nothing. When Miss Marple finished, the room was quiet except for the fire. "Did he feel anything?" Lady Bantry asked at last. "For me? Did he feel anything at all, do you think?" It was the question Miss Marple had expected, and had not yet decided how to answer honestly. "I think," she said carefully, "that what he felt was the closest thing to genuine feeling that he was still capable of, which is not the same as love, and is not enough, and does not excuse what he did. But I do not think you were merely interchangeable to him. I think he found you more than he expected to find." She paused. "I say this not to comfort you, but because I believe it to be true, and you have always deserved truth more than comfort." Lady Bantry was quiet for a long moment. "Hobbs," she said, "Hobbs, who planted the kitchen garden with Arthur in 1921, and always grew the wrong variety of sweet pea on purpose, because Arthur could never tell the difference. Yes. He died because he knew. He died because he was going to speak." Lady Bantry set down her cup and looked at the fireplace, where Arthur Bantry's portrait had hung for 20 years before being moved to the hall. She had moved it there herself after the engagement, thinking it better to make new space for new things. She would put it back, Miss Marple thought. Not now, later. "I am going to feel very foolish for a considerable time," said Lady Bantry, with the particular voice of a direct woman acknowledging something she would rather not. "I am going to feel foolish, and I am going to feel grieved, and I am not sure which will be worse. And people are going to be kind to me, in the way people are kind when something slightly embarrassing has also been terrible, and I find that variety of kindness quite difficult to receive." "Then don't receive it," said Miss Marple. "Be angry instead, for a while. You are entitled to be angry. He was a practiced deceiver. You were not foolish. You were deceived, which is an entirely different thing, and requires a different response." Lady Bantry looked at her. "You are not telling me to feel better. I am telling you how I think it actually is," said Miss Marple. "Feeling better will happen in its own time and without any assistance from me." The subsequent proceedings occupied the courts for nearly a year. Edward Vane, confirmed by Lancashire Constabulary, confirmed by the photograph, confirmed by Mr. Marsh's testimony, and ultimately by a second witness who had known him in Haslingden, was charged with the murder of Thomas Hobbs, the earlier suspected murder of Clara Forsyth of Clitheroe, and related offenses of fraud and deception. The question of whether the Haslingden elderly woman's death could be revisited was being examined by a separate inquiry. He was convicted of Hobbs's murder in the autumn assizes. The Clara Forsyth question remained legally unresolved for longer, the evidence being old and the witnesses reduced by time. Lady Bantry had the regimental photograph rehung in the library in November, where it had always been. She did not replace the pale rectangle with anything else. Diana came home for Christmas and brought Pauline Marsh, whose father wrote a brief and dignified letter to Lady Bantry, which she read and kept and did not reply to, which Miss Marple thought was the right response. A letter like that did not require an answer, only to be read and kept and occasionally understood more fully than it had been at first reading. Miss Marple's new rose, planted in October the same week as always, came up in May. It was a pale copper color, which she had not anticipated from the catalogue description. It suited the garden rather well. She was tying it carefully to its stake one morning when she thought, with the brief, clear intensity of a thought that has been forming for some time, Arthur Bantry had sealed an envelope and trusted the right time to come. He had been right about the time, and right about the person, and right about the provision, even though he had not lived to see it used. Some acts of faith, she reflected, work without their authors. She tied the last knot, stepped back, and looked at the rose. The garden was very quiet, and the morning was very fine, and somewhere in St. Mary Mead, the ordinary life of the village was resuming itself. The post office opening, the fete committee meeting, the comfortable daily industry of a place that had seen things and absorbed them and continued. Miss Marple put her gardening gloves in her pocket and went inside for her tea. The end. The will was corrected on a Tuesday. Lady Bantry signed the last page, set down the pen, and said nothing. Some moments do not require words. They require only the quiet dignity of a woman who has been through something and is still, unmistakably, herself. Gossington Hall was hers again. It had, in truth, never stopped being hers. But there is a difference between owning something and knowing it. And now she knew it, in the particular way one only knows things after nearly losing them. Hobbes's rose-bed was planted in the spring, by Diana, incorrectly, with great determination. The roses came up wrong and bloomed beautifully. Hobbes, Miss Marple thought, would have approved of the effort if not the execution. The regimental photograph went back on the library wall in December. Lady Bantry hung it herself on a grey Wednesday and stood looking at it for a long while. All those vanished men in their old uniforms, Arthur in the center, entirely unaware he had left behind exactly the right provision at exactly the right time. She had been angry. She had grieved. Then she had done what strong women do when they have finished grieving. She got on. Miss Marple planted a late rose that October, copper-colored, unhurried, stubborn in the cold. She tended it in the early mornings without ceremony. She did not think of Edmund Voss. She thought occasionally of Arthur Bantry, who had sealed an envelope, trusted the right time to come, and been, even in death, exactly enough.